Welcome to today's in-depth analysis. And before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay with us for detailed breakdowns of the most important stories shaping America and the world. A blunt warning from a leader on the ground. Oppose ICE and you risk violence, as a commander associated with the recent Operation Midway Blitz has been reported to say on national television, was never just a soundbite. It landed amid a deliberately escalatory federal enforcement push, a spike in on-the-street confrontations, and a polarized national conversation about law, order, and the boundaries of protest. That combination makes the commander's warning both a rhetorical device and a practical forecast. Rhetoric can become strategy, and strategy can create the conditions in which violence is more likely to happen. The federal operation itself was publicly announced and framed by the Department of Homeland Security as a targeted campaign to detain non-citizens with criminal records and to address violent crime, language and framing that recalibrates what the public and local officials perceive as permissible law enforcement action. Practically, the Midway Blitz rollout has three immediate, observable effects that matter for any realistic assessment of violence risk. First, concentrating federal resources and agents in neighborhoods where immigration enforcement has previously been scaled back produces fear and resistance among communities, and that social destabilization increases the chance of confrontations between agents and civilians, or between opposing groups at protests. Second, when enforcement is accompanied by high-profile imagery, armored vehicles, federal markings, social media-friendly "we've arrived" videos by operational leaders. Those visuals become rallying points for opponents and proof to supporters that force is being used credibly. Both reactions intensify the emotional temperature on the ground. Third, operational ambiguity, uncertainty about who is being detained, how long the operation will run, and what rules govern arrests, amplifies rumors, mobilizes community defenders, and invites political actors to weaponize incidents once they occur. The DHS announcement and early local coverage are consistent with these patterns. The operation was framed as targeting criminal illegal aliens, but local journalists and officials quickly reported arrests that appear to include people without recent convictions and a lack of clear public information about scope and timelines. Compounding the tactical and communicative dimensions is the deployment of high-profile commanders who have recent records of aggressive enforcement elsewhere. The official presence of commanders associated with earlier controversial sweeps, who publicly tout their methods, serves two purposes for the operation's architects. It signals competence and resolve to supporters, and it signals deterrence to undocumented populations. But it also feeds the narrative among opponents that the federal government is conducting dragnet operations where local norms previously limited enforcement. The arrival of such commanders has been accompanied by claims from local members of Congress and community groups that hundreds of people have already been detained and that the operation's reach extends statewide. Both the tallying of arrests and the rhetoric surrounding them now shape whether disagreements stay political or spill into street-level disorder. The factual record so far demonstrates the violence risk is not hypothetical. In recent days, a fatal shooting involving an ICE officer occurred during a detention attempt in the suburbs of Chicago, an incident that immediately electrified protests and hardened the positions of both supporters and opponents of the enforcement push. That shooting crystallized how rapidly situations can escalate from arrest attempts to loss of life, and how each such episode becomes a new flashpoint for demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, and sometimes clashes with law enforcement. It also focused scrutiny on operational tactics, vehicle stops, warrant service methods, use of force protocols, and on how federal operations coordinate or fail to coordinate with local law enforcement and consular authorities. Politically, the commander's warning underscores an uneasy triage inside the Democratic Party. Elected Democrats, governors and city officials in sanctuary jurisdictions, members of Congress representing diverse immigrant communities, and national leaders have two imperatives that pull in opposite directions. One is to protect vulnerable residents, mobilize legal resources, and call for transparency and oversight. The other is to avoid rhetoric that could be spun into justifying violence, or to appear indifferent to safety concerns raised by victims of crime. In practice, many Democrats have emphasized legal remedies, criticized the federal tactics, and called for investigations and constraints on the federal sweep, while simultaneously denouncing violence and urging peaceful protest. That posture has political logic. It seeks to defend civil liberties and community trust while avoiding the political risk of being labeled soft on law and order. Local Democratic officials in Illinois and Chicago, for example, have publicly pushed back against the operation and demanded details about targets and procedures, even as community groups organize street level resistance. Republicans and enforcement supporters, by contrast, have seized on the commander's rhetoric as vindication. For them, the claim that opposition invites violence functions as both a warning and a political wedge. It delegitimizes protests that obstruct federal agents and frames resistance as not merely political disagreement, but as behavior that invites dangerous consequences. That framing has two predictable results. On the policy front, it justifies escalated federal presence, more robust rules of engagement, and expedited removals, moves that appeal to hardline constituencies. On the political front, it makes moderates and swing voters who fear disorder more likely to accept aggressive tactics as necessary, at least in the short term. The public statements from national Republicans and some law enforcement figures tying anti-ICE rhetoric to attacks on agents feed a feedback loop where warnings of violence are used to rationalize ever larger enforcement responses. Public opinion is torn, and that division will shape both immediate outcomes and longer-term political consequences. Polling from a range of major centers shows a complex picture. Majorities in some recent surveys express support for targeted deportations of people convicted of violent offenses, and many voters across parties say they favor removing foreign-born individuals convicted of serious crimes. Yet, other large, reputable surveys reveal a broader trend toward more positive views of immigration overall, increased sympathy for pathways to legal status, and declining enthusiasm for sweeping mass deportation schemes. This mixed landscape means that local incidents, especially if framed as heavy-handed or if they produce civilian casualties, can rapidly shift public sentiment against an enforcement campaign. Conversely, a credible narrative that enforcement reduces violent crime can boost support among law and order voters. The plurality of views makes outcomes politically contingent. Small local tragedies can have outsized national effects in a polarized media ecosystem. On the ground, the practical results of the operation and the commander's rhetoric are already visible. In many neighborhoods, community organizations report a spike in fear, children are being kept home from school more often, and legal aid hotlines have seen surges in calls. Local officials, some of them Democrats who have resisted federal coordination, say they were not given sufficient notice or details, and that lack of transparency has made managing public safety more difficult. Where local police refuse to cooperate with immigration enforcement for legal or political reasons, federal agents either operate independently or bring in deputized officers, which in turn deepens mistrust and the chance for confrontational encounters. Courts and civil rights lawyers are already lining up to bring challenges, claiming insufficient probable cause and accusing the operation of sweeping in non-criminals. Those suits will further muddle the operational picture and could constrain the campaign if judges impose injunctions. If violence is defined narrowly, attacks on federal agents, the commander's claim is plausible. When federal agents are highly visible, some individuals or extremist elements may target them, and prior months have seen a handful of violent incidents directed at immigration personnel. If violence is defined more broadly, civil unrest, clashes between protesters and supporters, property damage, and aggressive crowd control responses, the odds increase substantially. The strategic logic is straightforward. Aggressive enforcement begets protests. Protests attract counter-protesters and law enforcement. Tightly packed protests plus heavy-handed crowd control techniques produce disorder. Disorder sometimes leads to injuries and, in worst-case scenarios, death. Conversely, a poorly communicated or indiscriminate enforcement campaign that detains many nonviolent or marginally connected people will enlarge the population motivated to resist, raising the baseline risk of volatile encounters. Media amplification. Viral videos of brutal-looking arrests or of agents shot at or pelted with projectiles shortens the distance between incident and mobilization. What are the realistic policy and political results likely to follow from this moment? In the short term, expect three things: a legal lobbying surge by immigrant rights groups and civil lawyers, heightened legislative rhetoric and potential congressional oversight fights, and local political mobilization that could translate into vote line effects in closely contested districts. In the medium term, the operation may harden partisan attitudes and create a rally the base dynamic for the party perceived as most willing to use force that will increase political capital for tougher enforcement policies among certain voters, even as it alienates others, particularly independents and suburban moderates who recoil at images of overreach. The credibility of local leaders, mayors, and governors who either successfully shield residents or fail to prevent excesses will matter politically and administratively. Courts will be central. Injunctions, class actions, and due process litigation can trim the edges off the campaign or, if unsuccessful, embolden further federal action. Finally, the normative and governance questions are stark. Democracies tolerate protest and dissent precisely because that space channels grievances nonviolently. When officials, federal or local, frame opposition as tantamount to incitement or as itself the source of violence, they run the risk of delegitimizing dissent and inviting the very confrontations they decry. Conversely, calming tactics, transparent target lists, independent monitoring, and community liaisons reduce the chance of violent escalation while still enabling targeted enforcement. Policymakers who want to contain violence without abandoning enforcement need a three-part approach: make operations legally tight and narrowly targeted, communicate clearly and quickly to local leaders and affected communities, and commit to independent, rapid investigation and accountability when things go wrong. Without those elements, a rhetorical warning that opposition will lead to violence becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because it signals that escalation is both expected and inducible, and that invites actors on all sides to act preemptively in ways that raise the odds of the worst outcomes. If you are tracking this story as it unfolds, watch for three signal events that will determine whether the commander's warning was prescient or performative, whether independent investigations substantiate claims of improper use of force, whether local law enforcement enters into formal cooperation or formal non-cooperation agreements with federal agents, and whether courts issue sweeping injunctions that materially alter the operation's tactics. Each of those outcomes will tilt the trajectory toward either de-escalation and rule-bound enforcement or toward further politicized confrontation and the kind of street-level unrest that no leader,